Hello, I'm Adam Hill, and I'm here to tell you about my journey to find a mythical creature. Based on the titles of other talks for this conference, and the number of questions I see while lurking in the Django subreddit, it appears that others are looking for this mythical creature as well. Now, many believe it doesn't really exist, but similar to my search for a friendly Yeti, I'm pretty sure I've at least seen a glimpse of it. So follow along with my field notebook while I document what I find. That is one mythical creature, but not exactly what I was looking for. The mythical creature I was searching for allows Django developers to build a modern, reactive website without writing any custom JavaScript. Don't get me wrong, JavaScript is just fine. Sometimes it's even not that bad. However, I have run into a few roadblocks trying to integrate a JavaScript front end with Django. There's the paradigm switch, not to mention the syntax differences from synchronous Python to asynchronous JavaScript. There is the high potential for duplicated business logic between the front end and the back end. There's the task of creating a REST or GraphQL API solely for your front end. There's also the performance hit when the front-end framework is parsed, especially with slower machines or network connections. And then you have to make sure that your site is SEO friendly. Plus, there's the age-old keeping up to date with JavaScript build tools. So I could have just given up on my dream of finding this mythical creature, but I'm pretty stubborn. I just couldn't escape the allure of less complexity, a simpler architecture, faster development time, and, let's be honest, less code. It sounds like a wonderful land of rainbows and sunshine, especially when some intrepid explorers have already found similar mythical creatures. For example, in the land of Phoenix, LiveView provides front-end interactivity using the back-end language Elixir. Because of the robust support for asynchronous processes, it uses WebSockets to communicate back-end changes to the front end. In the land of Laravel, Livewire provides a front-end framework using PHP and regular old HTTP calls. It is extensive documentation and screencasts demonstrating all the things that it can do. In the land of Rails, Hotwire made a splash when it was released. It provides front-end interactivity using Ruby and WebSockets to communicate back-end changes to the front end. Some explorers even want to traverse across different lands, all the lands even. HTMX isn't tied to a particular server-side language and is a lightweight way to provide interactivity without writing any custom JavaScript. Highly recommended. It's very fun to use. But this is DjangoCon, so we should talk about the land of Django, right? So let's get cracking. First, I'll briefly go over some code for a sample Django and Vue.js integration. Then I'll show a few Django packages that can create a modern, interactive website without writing any custom JavaScript. The packages we'll look at are Sockpuppet, Reactor, and finally, Unicorn. But first, we should talk about Vue.js. So I realize that there are lots of ways to integrate Django with a front-end framework, so the specific code doesn't matter too much. This is more to show an example of what might be required when integrating with Django. React would have different details, but the general gist would be the same. The first thing to realize is that most of the time on your local machine, you have two processes running for your site to render properly. One for the Django backend and one node process for the front end. This is the typical Django dev server. It provides an API, usually REST or GraphQL. It also provides the beloved Django admin. And lastly, Django serves a static HTML page, although sometimes Node will handle that as well. Let's look at the code required for the backend. Starting at the URLs, we can see that Django is serving the index and Django REST framework is providing an API route with the to-do view set, which you can see right here. Let's look at that view set. It contains a query set property that returns all to-do models from the database, serialized with this to-do serializer. The serializer uses this to-do model and outputs the primary key and the task for the to-do. Serializers are also where the validation of business logic would occur in the Django REST framework. So Django REST framework creates a nice interface that lets you interact with the API. You can see that here. If I click here, you can see we don't have any to-dos yet, but we could add one if we wanted to. Let's look at the actual site functionality. So I'm going to start yarn, which will be on 8001. Let's try something out. Nice. It seems to work. Let's check out the front end and see what is involved to build this straightforward example. Here is the index page that is served by Django. You can see it's pretty minimal and contains a div element where the application is mounted with the ID app. Now the real magic starts in main.js, where you can see the router, store, and render method. Let's look at the router first. It will stipulate what URLs are handled by Vue. You can see for this example, the root URL is handled by a component named to-dos. Let's look at that to-do component. Now it looks kind of like HTML, but it has some fun new attributes. For example, this V model is used by Vue to bind the input element to some task data. If we look at this button, the click attribute will bind the button to an add to do JavaScript method with an argument of task. And here is how to check for any to-dos with vif and to loop over your to-dos with v4. It is all in the excellent Vue.js documentation, but it's definitely different than the server-side rendered Django templates. At the bottom of this component, there is a reference to the store. It is the central location that retrieves and creates to-dos. It will call this getToDos method, which is specified here. That in turn calls another method in a service layer, which is here, where finally it'll call the backend Django API. Again, this overview isn't meant to explain all the specifics of how Vue works. It's more to show a typical setup when integrating a front-end framework with Django and all of its many complexities. I haven't even gotten to choosing and keeping up with a JavaScript bundler, deciding how to host the backend and front-end, or picking one of the many options to authenticate users. So that all sounds very complicated because it is, but there are some benefits to this approach. It can be useful to split up the responsibilities of a team, and it also provides a contract between the front end and back end to communicate to each other. And let's be honest, choosing a mainstream front end framework that is well documented and supported allows for easier hiring, an ecosystem of libraries that work well with the framework, and the ability to find at least some answers to your pleas for help on Stack Overflow. However, if the typical Vue.js integration is any mythical creature, maybe it's a Hydra? There definitely seem like there are a lot of pieces to wrangle and try to keep track of. And unfortunately, I am not Hercules, so I kept searching, and I found a few other options for Django developers who don't want to wrestle with that additional complexity. The first Django library is SockPuppet. It was originally inspired by the Rails library Stimulus Reflex. Let's see how it works with the sample to-do app. Alright, so just like the Vue.js example, there is a to-do model with one field task, which will store all the things that we have to do. Let's fire up the dev server. As you can see, it's using ASCII and channels underneath the hood for all the web sockets. And let's look at the website. It looks pretty similar to the Vue.js example. Let's try it out just to make sure that everything is working. Awesome. So let's look at the code and see how this is all implemented. If we go here, we can see the view. It looks like a class-based view, and it inherits from the template view. And it's wired up just like any other class-based view is in the urls.py. The getContextData method should look familiar for anyone who has used class-based views before. This is where the initial state for the view is defined and passed into the view context. You can see that I'm getting a list of all the to-do objects and storing them in this context variable to-dos. Let's look at the template and see how it gets rendered out. It looks like a Django template. You have if statements, you have a for loop here, looping over each to-do in our to-dos list, and we have the regular curlies to render out the variable. Let's look at how we add a new to-do into the database. And that uses those reflexes that are part of the framework. Let's go up here, inside of this input. It looks like a normal input, and then there is this attribute data-reflex. Key up is the browser event. To-do reflex is the class that gets instantiated for that reflex. And new task is the method that gets called on this reflex. We can also look at this button right here, and it looks very similar, except we're using click as our browser event, same class for the reflex, and then add to do for the method. So I guess we should look at the reflex to see how that works as well. That's right here. Remember that new task method that gets called on every key up in the input? Well, I'm just taking the value from that element, storing it as variable, and then setting it to the session. When the add to do method gets called, it takes new task out of the session, and it saves it into this to-do model, which stores it in the database. Since we are already rendering all the to-dos in a list, when a new to-do is saved in the database, it will show up automatically in that list, which is pretty magical. Let's look at the network requests to see how it works behind the scenes. Here is our developer toolbar. We see this is a WebSocket request, and we can look at all the responses. Search the cave. And we see right here, add to do, and all the new task events that get fired. SockPuppet is well documented and brings reactive capabilities to Django while leveraging the battle-tested Stimulus.js library. Another package that brings interactivity to Django is Reactor. It uses WebSockets and its own custom JavaScript library to communicate between the front end and the back end. Let's look at a sample to-do app for Reactor. It uses the same to-do model with a task field, just like all the rest of them. Let's start up the Django development server. Again, you can see that it uses ASCII and Django channels for the WebSockets, which are used to communicate the state changes from the front end to the back end. Let's try it out in the browser. Should look pretty similar to our previous iterations. And it looks like it's working. Let's look at the code to see the details. So Reactor has the concept of components that encapsulate some interactive functionality. You can see this component template tag on the index page. You can think of the component template tag as an include, but it's got some extra, magic. Here it's referring to a component named X to do. Here's the template for it. And it's going to look very similar to the SockPuppet demo. You can do all the regular Django template functionality like if statements and for loops that you would expect. Let's see how you listen to events. Here's our input, There's a name and a value with new task. And notice this @ sign and key up. So this input element is listening to the key up browser event, and it'll call this task method in the backend. Let's look at the button as well. It's similar. It is listening to a click event, and it'll call add to do in the backend. And this prevent is a modifier that basically means prevent default. Now let's look at the backend code. Reactor looks for components in a file named live.py. And here it is. You can see the component x2do is here. It subclasses from component. The first thing to note is this mount method. It loads the initial state of the component when it is rendered. Here we see I'm getting all of the to-dos from the database and setting them to a to-dos instance variable. The second thing to note is that the methods that we specified on the front end will all have receive underscore prepended to them in the back end. So the input element had task as the name of the method, and so here it is as receive underscore task. Here's the value, new task, that got sent automatically, and we're setting it to an instance variable on this class. Here's our add to do that was for the button click, and you can see that I'm taking the instance variable and creating a new to-do model, saving it to the database, and then I'm just wiping out our input element so that it's clean, and I'm re-grabbing all the to-dos from the database. Similar to SockPuppet, the list of to-dos on the front end will automatically be updated when this self.todos gets set. Let's look at the network requests again, and we can see the WebSockets. You can see that this is a WebSocket, and here are the responses. And as I type, you can see the WebSocket requests go back and forth, and that's awesome to see how well that all works. Reactor is a simple-to-use library that quickly lets you prototype, adding interactivity to your Django projects. Both of these Django libraries are super impressive, but they weren't quite the mythical creatures that I was searching for. So, while bored at the beginning of the pandemic, I stopped searching and finally created my own project. I named it Unicorn as an homage to the unofficial pony mascot of Django, and because of how magical it felt while prototyping the code. Let's see what our sample to-do app would look like in Unicorn. You just need to start up the regular Django dev server, and you'll see that it is just using just the regular WSGI. Let's go over to the browser and see how it looks. Wow, this looks super familiar. Let's try it out. And it looks like it's good. So let's check out the code to see how Unicorn approaches interactivity. The model is the same as before. Let's look at the index page. So you can see that Unicorn has the concept of components, and here I made a component named to-do. And we can look at the template. Rendering the current tasks is similar to our other Django solutions, where we have access to our normal Django template syntax. We have if statements, for loops, basically anything you would want to do with a normal Django template is available. But let's look at how the input elements work. This looks pretty familiar, right? Here's the input element for our task, but notice the unicorn : model attribute. That will specify what field in our backend component will be bound to this input. In this case, the field name will be task. Before looking at the backend though, let's look at the button real quick. This unicorn click attribute tells Unicorn to bind the add to do backend method to the click browser event. Let's look at how this all works in the components view backend. You can see that backend views subclass Unicorn view. Under the hood, That is just a subclass of template view. So the process of switching from a standard class-based view should be very straightforward. Remember when I said that the input element was bound to task? Here it is in the view. Note that I use types pretty extensively in Unicorn to help specify metadata about the class attributes, but they are completely optional. Also note, this hydrate method is called when the component is instantiated. And for this example, I'm just grabbing the latest to-dos from the database so that information is as up-to-date as possible. And here you can see the add to-do method that we're calling from the front end. It will create a new to-do model from the task and save it to the database, and then it just clears out the task. Let's look at how it all works in the browser. So as I type, you can see that there's a post. There's an HTTP post for every event that gets fired. And there's some JSON inside of here in the request that gets sent over, and then in the response that comes back. So if you see all these posts and you get a little concerned about all the network traffic, Unicorn has a few other tricks up its sleeve. Models can have a lazy modifier that only fires an HTTP call when the element loses focus, or a defer modifier that only calls the method when an action event fires. So let's look at that real quick. So in here, I can make it lazy. And now nothing is happening until I click outside and lose focus. And there goes the post. And let me show you the defer real quick as well. Defer is useful when you only want to send an event when an action is fired. So you can see that no posts are firing. Even when I click outside and lose focus, nothing fires. But when I click on the add button, we see our post. So I've slowly been adding features to Unicorn over the past year, like polling, loading, nested components, and tight integration with Django database models and query sets. And because the code is all server-side, unit testing the components is straightforward. And things like authentication, they just use the regular built-in Django functionality. Unicorn provides everything I need for a modern website quickly and without any extra complexity. No custom JavaScript, no additional APIs, no JavaScript bundling, no additional processes to run while developing on local, and no requirement on Django channels. It's quick to add into an existing site and make it feel a little more interactive. The projects I have mentioned most likely won't supplant the need for React or Vue anytime soon. However, in my wanderings, most websites don't need anything that complicated. Most sites are well served by a server-side Django website with a little bit of interactivity sprinkled on top. If you truly need an SPA, then by all means, definitely stick with one of the major front-end frameworks. I think I speak for all the projects mentioned, though, when I say that they are only as helpful as the community around them. I'd love for you to help any of these projects any way you can, starring their repo, trying them out on a new project, creating issues, updating documentation, even sponsoring the developers. Well, hopefully that was informative and a little bit fun. I'm Adam G. Hill on GitHub if you want the sample code, slides, or the transcript. And I'm the same username on Twitter. I'd also like to thank my coworkers at the Motley Fool who gave feedback on this talk, and my lovely wife Lynn who did all the art for the slides.
I just have a question.
Sure.
Do you think something like this would suit like a project in production or something like that?
A project in, I didn't understand the...
In production, so
In production?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the three
projects that I talked about, so Sock Puppet, Reactor, and Unicorn. They are all great for prototyping sort of newer projects. I don't know if any of them have been used in a big production scale sense. I'm still working on a bunch of features to make Unicorn sort of production ready, but I use it for all my side projects. So it's been used, but not for a lot of scale.
So you don't have like a clear idea on performance-wise on how it would behave with a heavy load.
No, not really. It's mostly a side project for me. If you think about all the HTMX talks that people did during this conference, it's very similar thought process behind it, though. You just do HX calls when things are changing, and you update HTML fragments from the back end, and then you swap out on the front end. So it should be pretty similar to any other, progressive enhancement framework. If anyone else has any questions, I can try to answer them.
Yeah, I have one question. I saw that that you need to inherit from Unicorn Vue. What kind of magic happens behind in this base view?
There's not too much. It's mostly setting up the template tag and providing a few sort of like abstract base methods that get called, like the hydrate, and there's a mount method. But it is basically a template view for all intents and purposes.
Thank you. It looks really great. I'm taking a look at the website.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, this looks super cool, and that was a great talk. Thanks. I'm curious. I'm interested in. I have a use case in mind right now that I think could be a good fit for this. I had two questions. One, like if I had a model with like 20 fields in it, is there any way around doing 20 post requests, like every time, like binding each input to a post request? I guess maybe the defer thing handles that, now that I asked that question out loud. And then the second question I had is like, how do you do UI feedback and validation and that type of thing?
Sure. So there's support for Django models and query sets in the component. So I try to provide, some nice sort of helpers, basically. So you might be able to get around having all the fields defined in your component separately. For validation, I try to utilize the Django Forms framework. So it's very similar. So you can basically set a form class on your component, and then it will use the validation just like a normal Django Forms. I try to sort of use Django bits and pieces so it felt like it was part of the framework and not something completely separate. That was the idea. I think your other question was about UI feedback. There are some, oh gosh, what are they called? Sorry, I'm looking at my documentation site just so that I have the. So I have some what I call loading states and dirty states, which are they're kind of taken from Livewire. If you've ever looked at the Livewire documentation, where I provide a way to basically target a particular div when things are changing in the back end. So I can basically like hide or show a div when that backend code is getting run. And the same thing for dirty states, which is basically like something changed, but it hasn't been persisted yet. So you can sort of like give some UI feedback in there.
Nice. Thanks.
Yep.
I do have a question. So you put everything in the same components, but I was wondering if there was any type of signal that was happening in the backend that was sent to the front end. So if my to-do list was in another component, then my input would my list still update? And what if I have another browser open? Will that browser also update once I add the list? And I guess that question works for all three libraries that you showed.
Sure. So for SockPuppet and Reactor, they use WebSockets, and so they're across different browsers. They will get updated. I know that's true for Reactor. I think that's true for SockPuppet. For Unicorn, because it's just, you know, HTTP posts, and we're not using WebSockets, it won't get updated in different browsers. It was basically a design decision that, for me, like I wanted to solve the 80% of use cases, and having browsers get updated in real time is really cool as a demo, but like I don't see that very often in my work. So I sort of didn't feel like trying to solve for it. For your first question about components signaling to each other, I do support nested components. So if you have like, I have a to-do example, which is basically there's a list of to-dos, and then you can, inside of the table, you can basically like delete or edit. And so it's not a signal, but I can listen to your child components, and you can call up into your parent. And so that's sort of how I've solved some of the like interaction between different components. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Adam, for the talk. I'm just trying to figure out in my head how that compares to Hotwire and HTMX, and it kind of feels like you feel like that's a progression beyond those technologies, or is that misstating you?
So I've only read through the Hotwire documentation. I have not used it in production, but my understanding is that they use WebSockets to sort of do their interaction. So it's a little bit different. And I think they have like Turbo sort of can be used in there too to sort of hijack clicks. So it's sort of its own thing. For HTMX, so the way that I think about it, HTMX and Alpine are really good as like a starting place. If you just want to add some simple things in. And then Vue and React are like on the other side of the continuum, where you basically like have to rewrite a bunch of things to go into their world. And I'm sort of trying to position Unicorn sort of in the middle, where it's a easy to add in, provide some interactivity that's a little more tailored to Django, as opposed to HTMX, which is very generic and can be used with anything. But it's not completely like rewriting your whole site to use to make it into an SPA. So I think there's a middle ground there, which again, for the 80-20, like I think benefits a lot of sites without too much work.
Okay, So Vue and React have a virtual DOM, right? Whereas HTMX and a Hotwire explicitly don't. You sound like you're doing a bit of more magic in the template on the front end than HTMX, but you probably don't have a virtual DOM. Am I right there?
Yeah, no virtual DOM. I'm using Morph DOM, which is a JavaScript library that basically you pass in your HTML and you pass in the HTML that you want it to morph into, and it will like smartly change your HTML from one to the other. Most of the libraries that I've seen, so Livewire uses Morph DOM, LiveView uses Morph DOM. I don't know if Hotwire uses it or not, but most of these libraries that don't have a complete virtual DOM implementation, they seem to use Morph DOM.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yep. I can answer any other questions if anyone has any, or I'm updating the chat right now with the answers to a few people who asked in text.
So can I ask you something? In the socket, Puppet, and Reactor solutions, a WebSocket is created per page, per form. Which actually
A website? Sorry, a WebSocket is created per page. Is that the?
Per page, so you can get updates for as many forms as a page contains.
Yes, from my understanding of looking through their code and their demos, that's what it looks like. Yep.
Okay, so maybe a user can have, if it has many tabs of the same site, it may have multiple web sockets per user. So I don't think that this is very performant.
Yeah, I think that's the way it would work. I think for any solution that uses WebSockets, it would create one WebSocket per tab, right?
Okay.
I think so. So then, yeah, I mean, the challenge is scaling out your WebSocket connections. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Is your mic working now?
Yeah. So let's say the replaced HTML contains a click or it contains a model. Will it automatically bind, like it's listening for a mutation listener, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if I've tested it explicitly, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer. What happens when the page renders, I basically look through all the elements for things that start with unicorn : and what I'm not positive about is when I swap in the HTML, if I go through the new HTML again. So I don't want to tell you the wrong answer.
Yeah.
But it's something.
Sure, because that's a very important use case when you replace.
Yeah. So as long as the HTML doesn't change, it'll work just fine. What I'm trying to figure out is if you like add in new unicorn : attributes after a transition, if those will get picked up, which I'm not positive. And so I can try to make an example. Okay. I'll make an issue in my repo, and then and I'll see if it works.
I'll really appreciate it because I've been trying to figure out which component framework to use for this. I'm using HTMLX. I'm using a bit of Turbo,
Hmm.
and I'm using some web components, Catalyst,
Hmm.
and it's kind of a mix. So this seems to be solving a lot of use cases for me, and I'm going to try it out. And this is one important one because if the HTML is swapping, then it has to work. Same with Turbo. If let's say I'm using Turbo and I just the Turbo renders the page, then if Unicorn is not listening, then it's not going to be able to pick up the attributes.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing that I should probably add in is making me think about it is a way to re-grab all the attributes manually if you want to. So I should probably add a hook in for that. But yeah, I have a couple side projects with that kind of mix HTMX and Alpine, and I wasn't using Turbo, but Unicorn is like the hope is that it sort of alleviates all, like trying to mix a bunch of things together.
Yeah, that's what I saw, and I mean, I really like the part where it's integrating well with Python, because all the others you have to do some kind of tricks to get them work.
Yep. Yeah, the goal is that it's pretty simple to add in and sort of gives you some benefits right away without jumping through a bunch of hoops. So I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but I feel like I'm pretty close to it. All right, I think I'm going to jump out of this meeting. But thanks to everyone for showing up and listening to me answer questions.